In this episode, we are going to take a look at the 1930s. This was a very critical period in Indian history, partly because of the emergence of new ideological trends. You are all familiar with what happened in the 1920s. It was a period of massive popular upsurge against imperialism. Civil disobedience movement at the early part of the 1930s also gave you a sense of the kind of ambiguities and the constraints within which the Congress leadership actually worked. The 1930s was important because from now on we see a very distinct left-wing factor, left mobilization, radical socialist vision permeating in Indian political life. This had something to do with the emergence of the Soviet Union, the successful implementation of the planning system by the Soviet leadership, which actually created a new vision before the political leadership, not just in India, but in other parts of the world as well. People began to look forward to a different kind of egalitarian world. This particular trend and the new ideological trends that I'm talking about had a very significant communist influence. The emergence of the Communist Party during the late 1920s and their involvement in different kinds of activity certainly brought about a new trend. The Congress too was not entirely immune to the impact of left-wing mobilization or these radical socialist visions. Within the Congress Socialist Party started functioning as a ginger group. So if you look at politics of this time, you see a certain engagement with these new ideological trends. So culturally or politically, the communist mobilization or the left-wing political vision provided a alternative to mainstream nationalism at one level, imparting into nationalist movement a new vision, and at the same time, if you look at political change of that time on an international scale, it was also a counterpoint to fascism.
So what kind of impact was it making, just not in politics but also in the other spheres of life?
Yeah, of course. I mean, that is a very important question because these new ideological trends did not remain limited to political life. I mean, certainly political organizations like the Congress began to be affected by these new trends. The congressmen had to engage with these new ideas. You have the communists emerging as an important factor, although not on the scale the Congress was, but still you can see the presence of them. In cultural life as well, you can see the impact. You can see the emergence of a kind of alternative cultural sphere as well. Prem Chand, for example. Prem Chand was inspired to a large extent by Gandhian mobilization. But then from the late 1920s, he had emerged as a bitter critic of capitalism, talking about a socialist transformation. He was a great admirer of Soviet Union, the new experiment in Soviet Union. You can see similar kinds of evocations in many Urdu writers of that time as well. But one of the more remarkable examples of how the Soviet Union had been able to make a very deep impression on intellectual mind was Tagore himself. He went to Soviet Union and on his return wrote that famous piece called Russia Chithi, or Letters from Russia, in which he expressed his admiration for the manner in which a new kind of society was being built in the Soviet Union by eliminating inequality, poverty, to give human beings their humanity. That is the kind of word that Tagore had used. So these are very important examples, Prem Chand on the one hand or Tagore in Bengal, of how great writers were engaging with such kinds of new ideological trends. But there were groups of literary figures who are actually creating their own alternative culture. Porichoy Goshti, for example, the Porichoy group, for example, in Calcutta, in which you have a radically inclined or men with communist beliefs, men with socialist beliefs. They were admirers of Tagore as well, but at the same time, they were trying to respond to these new ideological trends. You have historians like Sushobhan Sarkar, you have literary figures like Hirendranath Dutta. They were meeting and they were discussing among themselves the Marxism, socialist ideas, and trying to project before the public through this journal an alternative vision. You have similar such developments elsewhere too, where you can see groups of intellectuals trying to create the foundation of a different kind of culture, an alternative culture, imbibing socialist visions, engaging with these new ideological trends. For example, around the middle of the 1930s, you have a group of Urdu writers forming the Progressive Writers Union, the Progressive Writers Group. So all these trends would eventually climax in the 1940s with the formation of the Indian People's Theatre. Now, whether it was Progressive Writers Union or People's Theatre, the main accent of these intellectuals was on creation of a culture which would be able to respond more creatively to the demands and needs of the people. That, I think, is a very important ideological change, because intellectuals were now feeling a certain urgency to go to the people and talk about their needs, talk about their problems, making people aware through their writings and cultural activity the need to create an alternative society. So it is not as if that it remained merely limited to the political sphere. It began to affect other spheres as well, in the intellectual culture particularly. But politics certainly was important. And you see the kind of impact that these new ideological visions would make on political life. I was mentioning the Congress. The Congress itself started admitting people who had a different kind of vision, who were not always agreeing with the Gandhian idea that all the classes in the society would come together and cooperate with each other. Dange's idea that Gandhi had a responsibility, following Lenin, to telescope the two revolutions. You start a political revolution, and that is just the entry point to achieve a far more significant transformation in society by undertaking a kind of a social revolution. The point that Dange was making in the early part of the 1920s, some congressmen felt that the time had come for them to embark on a different kind of political line by espousing the demands, needs of the ordinary folks, just in the same way as intellectuals were moving in a different direction, without limiting themselves to the urban life or to the urban sphere. They were actually thinking of their contribution to the creation of an alternative ideological vision. So that is where you see a very important contribution of these new trends, ideological trends.
Sir,
Yes?
in India, there was a tradition of revolutionary activities. So, to what extent these new trends affected these revolutionary activities?
Yeah, but of course that is, in fact, it happened. We know from the works of scholars like David Loshe, for example, who wrote about the Bengal revolutionaries during the 1930s, that was the last phase of the revolutionary movement, how they were actually attracted to Marxism through their exposure to communist and Marxist literature during their internment. So many of them who had joined the revolutionary movement and at times were deeply religious minded people, they went through all those religious rituals and ceremonies which had been features of the revolutionary movement in the early stage, were becoming atheists and were being attracted to Marxism. You take the example of Bhagat Singh, for example, that Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, which became active during the 1920s in parts of northern India. Bhagat Singh was an atheist, and Bhagat Singh actually expressed in clear terms his commitment to socialist ideals. One of his followers, Ajay Ghosh, who was with the Hindustan Socialist Republican Army, became one of the leading figures of the Communist Party of India. Ganesh Ghosh in Bengal, for example, who became a very important provincial communist leader in Bengal, started as a Chittagong revolutionary. So within the revolutionary movement, you see these trends. People were thinking about the futility of the kind of strategy that they had adopted, the kind of revolutionary policy that they had adopted, resorting to these conspiracies and individual assassinations. They realized that these were not going to actually fulfill their targets. They were not going to fulfill their objectives. So they were moving in a different direction, considering the possibility of not merely organizing an armed insurrection, but a kind of revolution in which the people should be involved, a more broad-based revolution. So if you look at the revolutionary movement from 1920s onwards, you see a distinct trend emerging in the 1930s with the gradual conversion of these revolutionaries into Marxism. But that was not, of course, the only option before the revolutionaries. We know that when the revolutionary movement was moribund, during the 1920s, many of these revolutionaries actually decided to work within the Congress. They used the Congress cover and became involved in the partisan conflicts and the factional conflicts of the Congress as well. Take for the example of Bengal. One group, Jugantar group, supporting Subhash Chandra Bose, and the Anushilan group supporting the Gandhian leader like James Gupta, who was Subhash Bose's rival. Now, the new vision actually provided an alternative to the revolutionaries. They had formed the revolt groups who were not happy with the manner in which their leaders were actually becoming involved in Congress in fighting. They wanted a greater initiative. They wanted more assertive action. And one of the consequences of this was that last phase of revolutionary movement in Bengal, where you see a man like Surya Sen, a congressman, who was involved or who was participating at the same time in the SALT movement and then going to organizing a raid on the Chittagong Armory, creating a revolutionary thrust in the region. So you have such examples. You have that last sting of the revolutionary movement. But what is important, to which actually I was trying to draw attention by way of responding to a question, these people realized that this path of individual assassination, this mere armed insurrection, was not going to yield the results that they desired. So there was certainly an important change in their mentality, which comes as a consequence of their greater exposure to the Marxist literature. So in a way, I would say that the foundation of the Communist Party and its gradual consolidation, even though it was basically an urban party, was certainly bringing into Indian politics a new factor. The Communist Party, as you know, was formed first in Tashkent by a former revolutionary, Narendranath Bhattacharya, who was involved in Bagajotin's attempt to start an insurrection in Bengal. Once that particular plot collapsed, he went to the United States first and then came to Russia, formed the Communist Party at Tashkent with the support of the Soviet authorities. But that didn't make much of an impact on Indian politics, because even though he had been able to gather around him a group of former revolutionaries. But once the Communist Party was formed, around the middle of the decade, it began to infiltrate, it began to influence the labor movement. So the labor mobilization of the time had registered a very deep communist influence, and they were willing to work with the congressmen with radical visions. In the middle of the 1930s, they were willing to work with the Congress socialists. You have a number of labor strikes in the railways, in the cotton textile mills, in Calcutta, in the jute mills, jute belt of Calcutta, in Bombay, in the textile mills, in certain parts of southern India as well, where we find communists participating very significantly in the labor movement, organizing them, giving them leadership. These were urban intellectuals, many of them. They were actually trying to lead the workers and mobilizing them. Girni Kamgar Union, that was one of the leading unions in Bombay and exerting considerable influence among the textile workers of Bombay, was led by men like Dange. So these were the people who were becoming significant actors in the labor movement. Their strategy can be easily explained, that they wanted to create their base among the workers to be able to unleash or to be able to initiate the process of the proletarian revolution. But the problem with them was that in order to make an impact on Indian politics, they had to establish or they had to maintain a degree of cordial or degree of working relationship with other political groups, especially the Congress. So you look at the middle of the 1920s till the end of the 1920s, you can see them working together on the labor front. But towards the close of the decade, because these Communist Party of India had to go by the directives of the Communist International, the apex body controlled by the Soviet Union, so they sent out a directive to follow a kind of sectarian line, to maintain distance from the mainstream national bourgeois movement. So that was a period when they disaffiliated themselves from All India Trade Union Congress, which passed into the hands of the Congress leadership. But then they returned again to the mainstream around the middle of the 1930s, to drift again in the early part of the 1940s, when the need for fighting a people's war, I mean, that whole people's war controversy in the early part of the 1940s made some of the Indian communists somewhat indifferent to the last phase of mass mobilization by the Congress. But not all of them, of course. There were many complexities to which we return later. But the point is that the communists coming to the mainstream, then drifting from it, it became a very important weakness for them. But as far as the 1930s was concerned, we see them coming back to the mainstream once again around the middle of the 1930s, once there was a directive that the time had come for the communists to work out a popular front, a kind of united front with liberals, with national bourgeois parties, in order to fight fascism. Because by then Hitler had emerged as a menace, and the containment of the fascists required this popular front, and in the Indian context, this made possible the return of the communists to the All India Trade Union Congress and their involvement once again, along with congressmen, in the labor movement. So you see the emerging labor movement in the later part of the 1920s, a significant communist involvement. And of course others were also there, and you are also familiar with the famous Meerut conspiracy case, because 1929 the government introduced the Trade Disputes Act and the Public Safety Bill precisely to contain the emerging militancy in the labor movement, and taking advantage of these legislations, they rounded up some of these communist leaders like Muzaffar Ahmad and others who became involved in the labor movement, or a dange, and that famous Meerut conspiracy case as a sort of an indictment against the communists. But that gave the communists a kind of publicity that they had never received earlier. They were an urban group basically. You have Muzaffar Ahmed and his friend Nazrul Islam starting the journals like Langol and Gonobani. You have the journal Kirti, established by Santokh Singh with his Sohan Singh Jose, and others were involved. There were splinter groups being formed, workers and peasant parties in Bengal by Muzaffar Ahmed. You have the Kirti Kisan Party in Punjab, led by Sohan Singh Jose. You have all these splinter political groups which were linked with the communists, which derived sustenance from the labor movement. And it is in this context the return of the communists to the mainstream and their decision to work once again with the Congress, socialists particularly, certainly made a very important impact on Indian political life.
Sir, then what was the nature of this Communist Party? Was it merely a party of the intellectuals?
No. That's precisely the point that I was making. If you look at the initial stage, these were intellectuals. Some of them worked within the Congress. Bankim Mukherjee, for example, was a congressman who later became a very important trade union leader and then a member of the Communist Party in the legislature. So you have such examples of people affiliated with the Congress who became disillusioned with the Congress or became disillusioned with the early phase of the revolutionary movement and moved in a different direction. So I was talking about the many intellectual groups who constituted a very important element in the cultural movement. But if you look at the kind of initiative taken by Muzaffar Ahmed and Nazrul Islam in Bengal in setting up Workers and Peasant Party and setting up those journals like Gonobani and Langhol, if you look at Punjab, the case of Kirti, the journal around which the Kirti Kisan Party emerged, you have all these splinter groups which actually suggested the initiatives by these left-wing intellectuals. Some of them were communists, others were socialists who would be very happy to function within the Congress socialist group. Nambutiripat, for example, was a Congress socialist, but later on he moved towards the communists. So you have all these people who wanted to create an alternative political mobilization, a different kind of political initiative where the national movement required to be blended with radical vision of social transformation. So it was not enough for them to combine all these different social classes together in a movement against British rule. What was also important for them was to blend national movement with popular mobilization, addressing popular grievances. Say, for example, the abolition of the zamindari, reduction of working hours, improving wages, creating better living conditions for the workers. The Congress always had a certain ambivalent stand about the Indian business classes. They thought that the Indian business classes required to be propped up as a counterpoint to the domination of Indian economy by European business interests. So they were perfectly willing to start struggles and workers' movements in mills and firms owned by Europeans. They were somewhat reticent about the same strategy in mills and firms owned by the Indians. So this ambivalence was gradually shrugged off by this new kind of intellectual, this new kind of political activist who was responding to these new ideological trends to combine the national movement with more emancipatory ideals. So whether the mill is owned by an Indian businessman or by a European, it didn't matter for them. They wanted to start a movement in order to achieve better living conditions, better housing conditions, better wages for the workers. And you see the same impact in peasant politics as well, among the Kisan Sabhas. In the Kisan Sabha movement, if you look at the early days of the Kisan Sabha, UP Kisan Sabha was the first to be formed. Then you go to the Bihar Provincial Kisan Sabha established by Shahjahanand Saraswati. In the initial stage, they were not so vocal about the abolition of zamindari. They wanted redressal of peasant grievances. But abolition of zamindari would figure prominently in the Congress socialist programs once the Congress socialist group started functioning from 1934 onwards. An All India Kisan Sabha was established in the backdrop of the Congress socialist initiative towards a new agrarian policy, which included the abolition of zamindari as a very important demand. So All India Kisan Sabha was formed in 1936. So once the All India Kisan Sabha was established, you see people like N.G. Ranga in Andhra, for example, with who was collaborating Nambutiripat from Kerala. Together, they wanted to spread the Kisan movement in southern India as well around those more radical and emancipatory demands. So I would consider to be a very important impact that these new ideological trends was making organizational structure of the Congress by allowing the Congress socialist function within the Congress, by allowing the communists to ally with the Congress socialist within the rubric of the mainstream nationalism on the labor movement, making an impact on the peasant mobilization, imparting into the peasant mobilization a new radical vision.
So what was the relation between the mainstream nationalism represented by the Congress and the emerging left-wing activities, especially the communists?
Now, that was the point that I was making actually. We have already touched on this question of how the communists were actually following not a very consistent policy. They were with the mainstream, then for some time they drifted away. Then they returned to the fold again around the middle of the 1930s. There was another round in the early part of the 1940s. So that weakened the communist position to some extent. But as far as the 1930s were concerned, this was the time when we see the communists, the Congress socialists, all these were coming together. Organized student politics may be taken as another instance. In Bengal, you have the All Bengal Students Associations, dominated by the Congress. And as congressmen fought each other, factionally divided, the All Bengal Students Association also became factionally divided. But around the middle of the 1930s, you see the formation of the All India Student Federation. How leaders like Nehru or Subhas Bose, who were actually symbols of the left initiative within the Congress, Hiren Mukherjee, a communist intellectual, going around the country and addressing student conferences. Upendranath Dutta, a former revolutionary, becoming a communist and doing the same thing. So you see the same kind of impact in the student movement as well, and the kind of mobilization that the All India Student Federation would actually initiate would reach its climax in the 1940s. You have massive student upsurge on the eve of independence in 1945-46, not just in Calcutta, but in Bombay as well. You have such student initiatives in different parts of the country. So whether it is student politics or it is cultural movement or the emergence of the Congress Socialist Party, the kind of collaboration that we see between the Communist and the Congress Socialist Party on the labor front, on the peasant front, the more radical tone of the Kisan Sabha movement, the growing militancy in the labor movement, you see the impact of these new ideological trends in different spheres of social and political life.